I'm here with Alex Pappademas, the author of the upcoming book on Steely Dan titled Quantum Criminals, Ramblers, Wild Gamblers, the Other Soul Survivors from the Songs of Steely Dan, which is due out May 23rd via University of Texas Press. In the past, Alex wrote the book on Keanu Reeves titled Most Triumphant, The Movies and Meaning of an Irrepressible Icon, which I believe is coming out in paperback soon. And currently, you write for GQ. I know you did a recent profile on Travis Barker, which I thought was excellent. And you also written for the New York Times and the sadly departed Grantland. I know you did a great podcast with Wesley Morris. Do you like Prince movies, which I miss that a lot. Alex, welcome to What's Your Niche?
Ben, thank you for having me. And that's an amazing intro. I've done so many things. I feel so accomplished now.
Well, I've got my Steely Dan shirt on with the That's albums right. And stuff. The Joker Man put out, which I'll mention them a bit. You were great on the Joker Man podcast. I've loved your work going back to the Grantland days. When I found out you were writing a book on Steely Dan, who are truly one of my all-time favorite bands, I really couldn't have been more excited to read it, and I've lived up to my high expectations from reading it. So it's true. I think it's the best writing on Steely Dan I have ever read, and I can't wait for everyone else to get a chance to check it out. So as you mentioned this in the book, but for the audience at home, what was your gateway into getting into Steely Dan?
My gateway, okay, so I probably heard Dirty Work first on 104.5 KFOG out of San Francisco when I was growing up. For whatever reason, I have a memory of hearing that in the back of my mom's car and not having any real reaction to it. But just like when I think about Dirty Work, I'm like, oh, I heard that song when I was like 9 years old, something like that. I think my gateway was via the Minutemen, the great San Pedro punk band, the Minutemen, who covered Dr. Wu on their amazing album Double Nickels on the Dime, along with there's like 3 cover songs on there. They do Ain't Talking About Love by Van Halen, and I think there's a Blue Oyster Cult song on there as well. Yeah, they did Dr. Wu, and this was back when I think anybody shopping for vinyl now, like everything's $40, but back in the day, $40 would buy you like 40 records easily, like if you knew where to go. And so you could really take chances on things. And so I bought a copy of Katie Lied, kind of, I bought it ironically. I bought it sort of like, imagine me, with my punk credibility, listening to Steely Dan at home, and I figured I'd sort of check it out and then file it and just kind of be like, hey, look at this ridiculous thing that I bought. Cut to me writing a book about Steely Dan, like that. It's like that's how you fall down the rabbit hole, because I think like what you quickly realize is that if you grew up in the 90s, you got a lot of like weird kind of received wisdom about Steely Dan, and then once you actually get into it, you find that they are so much more complex and funny and ironic and humane and just kind of, to me, endlessly interesting, and that whatever sort of like kept you from getting into them, the sort of those are prejudices against like the way that you have an idea in your head about what music is supposed to sound like. And I think as you get older, you kind of realize that that's all just bunk, and that there's really a lot of interest to be found in smooth music, smooth jazz. There's like very few frontiers left there where it's like where I won't go, I guess. Long explanation. The rest is history.
Yeah, I mean, I really relate to that because we're doing this from a university radio station, Calgary, which again, it's kind of like you have this great term in the book. You kind of had like a lo-fi chauvinism as growing up, which I really like that term. And so, but then you kind of grew out of that and you saw the appeal because you're true. Like, I think one of the eye-opening things is that Pitchfork review of Two Against Nature at the time, and just what a brutal, and that ties into them winning Album of the Year, the Grammys in 2001. And for my own gateway, briefly, talk about weird. Wait, I bought one of those Grammy nominations 2001 CDs. Like they always put the nominations on a CD every year, a compilation. And I've got the track list here briefly. Destiny's Child, Say My Name, Macy Gray, I Try, Madonna Music, NSYNC, Bye Bye Bye, all the big hits. You Too Beautiful Day, Go On, Go On, Go On. And then Steely Dan's Cousin Dupree sliding in there and hand on a Bible, pretend there's a Bible here. The first Steely Dan song I ever heard was Cousin Dupree in the context of that. And it's just, which just was, as you can imagine, like just in the subject matter, just But it really stuck out to me at the time, and just the whole thing from the Grammys and kind of the backlash they got for beating Kid A and Marshall Mathers LP really kind of defined my generation of just being like anti Steely Dan for a lot of people.
Yeah. Did you know who they were before you knew that you were supposed to hate them for stealing Radiohead's Grammy?
No, because I mean, I was young enough, like, oh boy. I was probably like maybe 10, 11. So I was kind of relatively young. So just like they were just a band. It was, but just, it was, again, weird in the context, too. Like all the pop hits of the time. I think there's like that kind of like that late era Paul Simon, You're the One, which is like, I like Paul Simon, but that's not one of his best, I think. But then Steely Dan, and again, the subject matter of that song is just incredible. But just, I was just like, oh, this kind of toe tapping fun as a kid. Like, oh, good beat. Not paying, again, as a kid, not really delving into the lyrics.
Fully, yeah, realizing what Cousin Dupree was proposing in that scenario. Yeah, sure. You were just kind of, yeah, this is all right. You know, that's better than Say My Name, I guess. Something's going on here. Yeah, no, I love them being in that lineup, because as much as they sort of stick out in the 70s, it was just that much crazier that this was a band, with a Grammy winning album in 2000.
And there's, I guess, that's the whole thing too of like, because they hadn't won album of the year prior to that, but they've been nominated in the past for like Asia and Gaucho, I believe. So just like there might have been the thing like something like Oscars when like Scorsese won for The Departed. It's like finally he won Best Director, but then it's like, oh, Steely Dan won album of the year, but in it's again in context of Kid A, which is just this behemoth landmark, and Marshall Mathers LP, which was just the populist choice, which maybe hasn't aged as well, certainly, but at the time, it was a juggernaut.
Yeah, I mean, I wonder if I like, and isn't Beck in that hunt?
Yeah, Midnight Vultures.
Yeah, Midnight Vultures is in there, which I love. Midnight Vultures is
Me too.
That might be my favorite of those nominated records. Honestly, like I'm a big Radiohead fan, but it's not Kid A for me. It's like actually it's earlier and later. But yeah, I feel like maybe so like Radiohead and Beck kind of split that vote, probably. Like all the hipsters kind of voted one way or the other, the sort of people voting for like the young cool artist, because Midnight Vultures is fantastic.
Because Odelay hadn't won for album of the year.
Yeah, no, I mean Midnight Vultures is never. It's like I think it's underrated. It probably wouldn't have won. Like if it was a sort of even like in a less contested kind of space. But yeah, I feel like there's got to be some kind of a vote split, because also I feel like the sort of people like voted for one of those three kind of like young cool guy records, and then that Steely Dan ended up like with the sitting in the chair somehow.
And it's just, like these, again, older guys just coming to the stage when you're at the time, because Eminem was riding the wave. I think as a kid, I was thinking, oh, it's Eminem's to win. But like, who are these old guys? And I remember, like, that's from the CD. Like, that's just like the weird kind of, not throwaway, but at least as a kid, like, what is the weird outlier between, again, also Christina Aguilera's What a Girl Wants is also in that CD, I believe, right afterwards. So,
wow.
The Cousin Dupree.
What a girl wants Cousin Dupree. Just propose sleazy things to her. That's the message. Yeah, no, I mean, it's like, I feel like, I talk about this in the book, but like, it was a very sleazy moment in pop culture, like the early 2000s. Like it was there was a lot of a lot of what Steely Dan was sort of ironically celebrating and transgressively celebrating, or at least sort of examining as a kind of strain of male behavior. A lot of that had become like almost like mainstream culture, like in the way that the way that people photographed Britney Spears back then. And obviously we've had kind of a national reckoning with some of that. But it just made it that much wilder that Steely Dan were able to walk in and win the Grammy that year. But I also like that was the year that Eminem got so much heat. There was a GLAAD protest outside of the Staples Center because of Eminem's homophobic lyrics and everything. And then Donald Fagen got up and sort of, referenced it, I think, by thanking Eminem for taking the heat, which meant that nobody looked that closely at what Steely Dan were saying. So it's, I found it. This is in the book too, but like I think all of those records, in some way or another, fit into a Steely Dan kind of paradigm, and you could make a case, which I try to make, that it's almost as if the other nominees in the category sort of like testify to the importance of Steely Dan, as well, because I think Midnight Vultures is the most Steely Dan Beck record in some ways,
Oh
and
yeah.
Kid A is a record made by people who hate touring, which is a very Steely Dan thing to hate. And Eminem, as discussed, like transgression, weirdness in that way.
Yeah, so I'm speaking with Alex Pappademas, author of the upcoming book on Steely Dan titled Quantum Criminals, Ramblers, Wild Gamblers, and the Other Soul Survivors from the Songs of Steely Dan, which is due out May 23rd via University of Texas Press. Tell me, describe where the title Quantum Criminals comes from.
It is a quote from the great Walter Becker, the late great Walter Becker of Steely Dan. He was walking home from the studio, I think, late one night and got hit by a taxi cab and was kind of laid up for the rest. This is while they were making Gaucho, and like this was kind of the last straw for his involvement in the sort of day to day making of Gaucho, I think. And later on, somebody asked him, what happened, and he was like, "We were quantum criminals. The cab and I were trying to occupy the same space at the same time." I just liked it because it sounded like a Steely Dan lyric, but it's not a Steely Dan lyric. It was something said by one of them, and I know nothing about quantum physics. I don't know if Walter did. I don't know if it's actually scientifically correct, but I liked it. And then obviously there's a lot of real criminals in this book, actual criminals. And then there's a lot of people who are in some way or another, transgressors, who are people on the run from something, on the run from themselves, on the run from each other. Like it just sort of, and it was, we were going to, we knew the book was going to be kind of a rogues gallery. So it kind of felt like that's exactly the thing to say. I don't think we tried that many things. Like, shout out to UT Press for not making me put Steely Dan in the title, because they always make you do that. Like, there's a reason. Like my Keanu Reeves book is in my head. Paul Thomas Anderson calls Hard Eight Sydney still, in my head, that book is still called We Never Free a Mind Once It's Reached a Certain Age, which is a Morpheus quote that has no SEO value whatsoever. And so they made me put Keanu Reeves in the title. But, UT was cool with us having a, subtitle with the band name in it.
And you kind of touch on going on to the Rogues Gallery. What I really like about the book is, rather than being kind of like a dry chronological retelling of Steely Dan's legacy, is you break it down by the characters talked about in the songs and stuff, and also chapters on Donald and Walter and figures like that. So what kind of inspired you to get into for the book to take that form?
This book kind of had a weird genesis. I mean, I guess all books do in some ways. But my friend and former coworker, Jessica Hopper, had taken a position where she could acquire books for UT. She was working on the American music series. She was like, "Do you have a music book in you?" And I was like, "I could write a Steely Dan book." Because I feel like that's a subject that I, much like Keanu, that I kind of never get bored of thinking and talking about. And then at the same time, Joan LeMay, who did the illustrations for this book, who did the paintings, who's an old friend of Jessica's and a former coworker, was going to do a zine where she was going to draw all of the Steely Dan characters. And like she put up a picture of I think Donald and Walter on Instagram and sort of announced that she was going to do the Dan zine. And both Jessica and I like texted each other immediately. We're like, "That's an incredible rubric for a Steely Dan book." Like, I think I'd written a proposal already, or I was working on one, but we kind of were like, "Hey, can we sort of Frankenstein these two ideas together and turn it into a book?" And it was additive in a huge way, because it really sort of, it changed the way I was thinking about all of these things. And it kind of gave I love structures and sort of, things where it doesn't feel like I'm sitting down to write a 350-page book. Like it felt like I was sitting down to write these little essays on each of these, like related to each of these songs and each of these characters. And so it opened up a different way of doing it. And talking to Joan about the images and about the sort of content of the essays, like opened up a different, that was kind of how it came together. But yeah, I didn't, I think like, there is like there's a new biography of Donald that came out like while this was, a couple months ago. People are, people have done that. People have done the sort of attempt at the chronology, and like, there's so much obfuscation in Steely Dan's public presence. And there, that I thought it would be more fun and more interesting for a reader, I guess, to read, somebody kind of just thinking about it rather than trying to nail down like, the sessions for the Asia Rage, like there is that information's out there if you want it. Like you can read certain, you can read about, all those things. But it was more like, I don't know. I thought about like, books like Rob Sheffield's Dreaming the Beatles. That was in the proposal because I feel like that's about the life of this music once it gets out into the world and touches other things, and people sort of reference it and all of those things. And I kind of wanted to just trace out from within the discography, if that makes sense.
No, it does, and I think that your approach is it's so brilliant. Is that just like because something I get asked as because I'm known as the Steely Dan fan, oftentimes in friend groups, and I have to and it's like, what's the deal with them? Because most people honestly don't get it really, and I'm like, what's the deal with them? And I'm just I don't know. Because very briefly at another college radio station a few years ago, my show was called Just Steely Dan and Wrestling, where I played a discography and talked about current events, and because I'm a big wrestling fan too, another kind of scarlet letter, whatever, was for certain people, and just like because I thought like the mix of high and lowbrow kind of thing, but just like, and I don't know, but just so I just think for people who want to be converted, like some friends of mine, like sincere, like how do I get into them? Like it seems kind of whatever, just I think the way you break it down in the chapters, like for the King's chapter, for example, like you're talking about the song, but you're talking about like Nixon and Kennedy. Like you talk about those topics that they're talking about in the songs, so you really understand these songs, which might be kind of dense to understand or otherwise, but I think the approach is great.
Well, thank you. When you did just Steely Dan and wrestling, did you connect the two, or was it just kind of these are the two things that I'm going to be talking about from week to week? Like there will always be some of these two things in the show.
I tried to start, but it's funny. We're getting really into the thing is like I joined like a private Steely Dan Facebook group to promote it. So it's like, and then like, there's, I was like, hey, and then they're like, oh, what's this? But then I think they tried to there was the line from They Bite from Steely Dan, like trying the most similar line to wrestling to the thing because there's not a ton of like equation to it, but it was fun though.
Yeah. Well, it's weird because the Steely Dan is one of my kind of deepest kind of niche obsessions, and wrestling is one of the things that I have the least comprehension of. I would have been exactly the audience for 50% of that show, and the rest of it, it's like I know it's fascinating, and I know it's like this kind of like Rosetta Stone that like tells you a lot about our culture and everything, especially pro wrestling. Josie Riesman has written this book about Vince McMahon that I'm very excited to check out. Ringmaster. I'm very excited to check it out, but it's like I know, I'm basically like, this will be the first book I have ever read about wrestling, so like it better be great because I'm probably not going to read another one. And so like I'm hoping it's amazing because I really want to get in there and do that, but and learn about it. But yeah, for whatever reason, it was just something I completely missed in my 80s childhood and just never connected with. But
I'm speaking with Alex Pappademas, author of the upcoming book on Steely Dan titled Quantum Criminals, Ramblers, Wild Gamblers, Other Soul Survivors from the Songs of Steely Dan, which is due out May 23rd via University of Texas Press. And you mentioned Joan LeMay's paintings, which are just stunning. And I just that's a reason enough. You get your amazing writing and these paintings which complement and like these characters who Donald and Walter describe, and just the kind of personification and stuff. And it's really, really cool to see Joan LeMay's interpretation and just these beautiful paintings. I will say, you mentioned Walter Becker, because Donald Fagen, like, he's like the lead. He's the lead, he's always singing and stuff, because Walter only sang one song in the career. And so describe kind of what Walter brought to it, because I think, especially when I was getting into it, you're like you see him playing it, and it's just like, they co-wrote all the songs together. What do you think what Walter Becker brought to it? Because I'm a big fan. I brought my 11 Tracks of Wax CD, which I played this all summer last year, and the greatest. So tell me tell me a bit, like, as in what kind of, to the layperson, like what Walter Becker brought to Steely Dan.
They asked the guitarist Steve Kahn at some point, who played on some of their records. Like, I think he said that he asked Donald once, what it is that Walter brought to it, and it was like Donald said, Walter finishes the things that I can't finish. like Donald would have ideas and then he'd go to Walter and Walter would be like, just bit, 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 just do that. And then like they would have a song out of that. Um, I think that there was also something about working with a partner that let both of them probably express things that they maybe would have felt nervous to express if it was some kind of thing where it's like I'm James Taylor, this is me and my guitar, I'm going to play a song and you're going to assume that all these songs are about me because I'm the solo guy standing up here and doing this. There was something about sort of like, again, obfuscation, like there was something about it being a collaborative thing, being a sort of, a shared artistic persona that I think like set them free to create something, like Cousin Dupree, like, because they were making each other laugh. And so it didn't feel so, somehow it felt like there was a distancing device that allowed them to write about different things in different ways, in different voices, and kind of get into these characters in a way. And I mean, this is surmise. This is, me guessing at it a little bit. And, it's an educated guess somewhat, but I think there was something about Walter kind of living the life that Donald sort of imagined as a bohemian existence. And especially like, down the road, it seems like Walter's the one who kind of gets into drugs once they're out in LA. And like he's kind of living some of this life that they are writing about. And I think that by the time you get to Asia and then especially Gaucho, I think some of that like it's more it's not so fictional. It's more based on real experiences. I think there was something about I think Walter lived on an edge that was interesting for both of them to kind of talk about and write about. But I think Walter was kind of out there doing it a little bit. It's just interesting you bring up 11 tracks of whack. Like you can really I think hear the difference when you listen if like the solo records revealed a lot it, retrospectively about like what was happening, who was doing what and who was responsible for which kinds of ideas on the original 70s Steely Dan albums. And I think you can, there's like when you listen to the Night Flight, it's like the nostalgia aspect like comes and the space age kind of fascination comes from Donald. And there's a little more of a hard boiled aspect to the way that Walter writes, especially on, 11 tracks. Like it's a very, it's like, he's like a Warren Zevon-ish kind of guy, as it turns out.
Yeah, I'm just looking at the back cover again. It's like it's the baseball bat through the glass. Like, I mean, that's sort of like that's just right there. There's a very hard, and I know like he recorded like his home in Hawaii and stuff, and just I just love that. And so, and then the other kind of thing that's another is like David Palmer, who was for Can't Buy a Thrill. Like, just what a weird kind of fit that was, because like some of their biggest hits is this bellowing like vocalist singing. And as they realize, like, Donald is, of course, the guy to sing these songs, but just kind of describe how David Palmer kind of initially, I would say fit in, but he certainly didn't fit in. But like he suits those songs, I do think.
He's good. Yeah, I mean, like those songs are good, and those songs are some of the biggest hits. And that's the weird part is that they associate, people who only know, because that's the crazy thing about Steely Dan, right? Is that they have 7 or 8 giant hits. Like it's one of those things. Like it's as if like Big Star was also Cheap Trick. Like there's somehow like there's a they're a cult band over here, but then like they have the thing that most cult bands don't, which is like huge songs. It's like like 10cc had like one really big had I'm Not in Love, but it's like as if there were like 8 or 9 of those, and then the rest of it is the weird kind of 10cc catalog that we know about. Like that's the like it's hard to find comps for Steely Dan because of that. So Palmer, Donald never thought of himself as a singer. Like he never imagined like he would sing on their demos, but like when they were writing, they sort of imagined they were writing for other people, and then they basically only formed a band because they had taken this deal with ABC Records and moved out to California, and like nobody wanted to record these weird Steely Dan songs that they were writing, and so they were like, I like basically ABC's like, you have to do it. You have to form a band and do this. And Donald doesn't imagine himself as the singer. His voice, he has trouble with his voice. He's always kind of has, like he writes about it in his book. Like as he's gotten older, it's only gotten harder, as it does for most singers, who don't like figure out the way to do it. So they recruit this guy, David Palmer, who's like every inch the front man. Like he just looks like, you've seen, if anybody hasn't seen him, he looks like Roger Daltrey. He looks a little bit like, like Peter Frampton or something. He has velvet pants and kind of outstage outfits, and like does a kind of like he dances all over the stage like the laughing gnome with like his tambourine and stuff, and like just does all of the things that Donald would never be comfortable doing and would just never. So he's everything that Donald isn't. It doesn't seem like they really sort of meshed with him creatively in any way. Like they had to write a bunch of new songs that they for him to sing in shows that they never ended up recording. I don't think that it was. I think it was a kind of a commercial expediency that they needed this. And clearly, like if you look at their early press photos, like ABC was like, this is the guy. Like we finally like we've got these great songwriters, and like these guys, Donald and Walter will be the songwriters with Mystique in the back, with the sunglasses on, and then David will be like out in front, like kind of really putting it out there. But it doesn't last, and like there's stories about like why it didn't last. I don't think it was a really good fit personality wise, and I don't think it was ultimately what they wanted. Like it's weird to imagine a world in which he sort of went on to stay in the band forever. Like I just wrote about Depeche Mode, and not that like Dave Gahan was not their choice for vocalist, because he was, but like that was a weird kind of power sharing arrangement, is a power sharing arrangement where like Martin Gore writes most of the songs for years, and Dave just kind of sings Martin's words and brings them to life in a way that Martin can't. Like it's been done, but I don't think these two guys, being the control freaks that they were and having the really strong artistic vision that they had, I don't think that they could have gone for much longer with somebody else kind of in that job, in that frontman position. So Donald gets kind of pushed forward to do it. Even though he's often writing songs that he can't really sing, that are kind of outside of his vocal range, and like that would continue as well, because but that's the Steely Dan thing. It's like we are writing music that we can't necessarily sing and play, and over time it's like, why are we going to be limited by what we can do when we can bring in all these guys, all these session guys to play all this music, which is antithetical to the rock band concept, but like gets you to that's how you get Asia. That's how you get Wayne
Yeah,
Shorter playing on Asia, because like they can't do that. But like
1,000,000%.
call the guy from Miles Davis's band, he can do it.
Yeah, and like you're talking about like starting to write for songs. That's probably a thing I found out like a few years ago. Like then the Donald Walter started the Brill Building, just writing
Mm-hmm.
something like for like Barbara Streisand. Which again, talk about what you know about Steely Dan, like writing a song for like Barbara Streisand and others at the time. Just like that's how they got. But I guess I know there's such students, especially Donald, of like that older music and stuff, or current at the time. But
Well, yeah, and it's weird because they move to New York, they get out of college and they move to New York, and they gravitate to the Brill Building because that's something that they've imagined, that this is where you will go to be at the center of pop music. But it's not the center of pop music anymore. It's kind of it's in decline, but it's also like, I mean, he's talked about it. Donald's talked about it, that like they're all trying to be hip. It's like it's a little bit late Mad Men. Like they all kind of like these like old time songwriters have put on like Nehru jackets, and like they've got he's like, they got gumball machines in their offices, and like it's kind of like, it reminds me of, you hear about like when John DeLorean was becoming like the hippest guy at General Motors, like, and he was, kind of like stopped wearing a tie and everything. But yeah, so they sort of gravitate to this version of pop music making that is dying, that's been dying since the Beatles came out. It's been dying since like people started writing their own songs, became, important, and started people that as a criteria for things. And so they're just writing songs. They didn't write that song for Barbara Streisand, I Mean to Shine. They just wrote a song, and that was who recorded it. And it just happens to be because Barbara Streisand became so hugely famous. That's like a weird sort of quirk, but like they were just writing for whoever would, wanted to record these songs. But at the same time, if you listen to those songs and you listen to them talk about them, I don't think they really cared if anybody recorded them. They just want to get paid for writing a song. And they would they basically, and they were almost like, this is, so, I think the thinking was, some dork is going to record this song and they're going to kind of take it away from what we imagine it was going to be. So we're going to put lyrics in here that like no one would ever record. Like it's just, and if you listen to the Steely Dan demos that have leaked out, that are all over Spotify, and you can find them in various places, you can hear it. Like they're not thinking about what's going to be a big hit pop song, and so like they're just kind of they're writing about William Burroughs in 1968, when that was not something that would have been on on the radio. So I kind of love it, because it's both like sort of naive and also perverse, that you would want to do that and that you would want to go about it that way. But like they didn't think of, they weren't singer songwriters. That's where that term comes from, because at some point, those two things were very separate. And like the idea of a singer songwriter is like, oh, it's somebody who can do both. And like they never really imagined they would have to do both.
I'm speaking with Alex Pappademas, author of the upcoming book on Steely Dan titled Quantum Criminals, Ramblers, Wild Gambles, and Other Soul Survivors from the Songs of Steely Dan, which is due out May 23rd via University of Texas Press. And that's such a good point. I was thinking of like Lou Reed starting getting Pickwick Records, similar thing too, which is another thing. It's like, you think of everything with Lou Reed, like he's starting writing songs, but he's obviously heavily influenced by doo-wop and stuff but yeah, so anyway, what song, to make a jump, do you feel is kind of the most like prototypical Steely Dan song? And also, this is a hard question. What would you say is your favorite Steely Dan song?
Oh man.
Putting you on the spot.
Like prototypical. I mean, I guess maybe Peg. It might be the best if I was trying to, because I have to do this at some point as a part of book promotion. I have to do a playlist and kind of like write some little blurbs, and I haven't done that yet. You're reminding me that I have to do it. But I think I led off that playlist with Peg because I think that it's illustrative of a bunch of the things that were going on, where it's incredibly meticulous and layered, perfectly produced, where you can kind of hear everything that every instrument is doing and how they kind of fit together. Like William Gibson, the writer of Neuromancer and books like that, has written about as the song. It's almost like you're looking at something through like layers and layers of lacquer that have been applied to a surface. It's like so shiny, and yet you can see all the way down because it's so perfectly done. And then it's a really good pop song, really amazing, catchy pop song, until you start thinking about it, and then you're like, what is this song even about? Like, I can't, and it's hard to say, like what the narrative is, and it might just be that these words sound good together. It's I got your pin shot, I keep it with your letter, and it's just kind of like it's so incredibly catchy. You've got Michael McDonald in there, which is kind of like, that is also the set part of the sound of Steely Dan to me, that crazy instrument of his voice, in this case kind of doing a wild 3-part harmony that he's explained, that like just how hard it is to do. So I feel like that might be it's a good place to start. And there's something something vaguely seamy going on there, but it's not really clear like what's happening. But it feels like is Peg in danger? Is there something going? Is like this is who's singing to her, and what is this character's intention? What's and all of that. My favorite Steely Dan song, though I don't know if I can even answer that question. It's hard. I mean, I like it, and I think it varies, and it varied. I mean, that's why this was a good book for me to write, because I don't get sick of this stuff, and I find other things that are interesting about it. I will say that on certain days, it's Home at Last. I think that that's one of the best it's one of the best songs about commitment, which is not necessarily a great subject within pop music. It's not like, it's the sort of long-term relationships don't generate the best or sexiest music necessarily, except for maybe some Al Green songs and things like that. But there's something about Home at Last that just there's something going on in there, and it's this very sort of highbrow metaphor, because it's about the Odyssey, so it's like has a Homeric aspect to it, but it's also a great song about Los Angeles. And I always think about it, I was just away and I came back, and to LA where I live, and I always think of Home at Last as we're sort of flying in over the freeways, and so that's first among equals for me.
I can't disagree. Like, it's just thing, like, you go through phases a lot with all these albums too. It's like, and this month you're really into Gaucho, and I think I've been listening to Pretzel Logic a lot recently, weirdly, but it just happens. It just, yeah.
Yeah, you just find things. I mean, yeah, no, Gaucho's in there too, for sure. I mean, I've been thinking a lot about Third World Man. I think I talked about Third World Man on a podcast, and like, there's obviously that crazy, strange story about how that song came to end up on Gaucho. I think I might be guilty of underrating it a little bit in the book, just to talk about, in order to talk about the lost song that it replaced, the second arrangement, the famously sort of
Right.
destroyed song that they could never recreate, which is such a perfect metaphor for the whole Steely Dan things that they are, at some point, they're just like, no, we can never, this song, you can never hear this song because we were never able to record it. It's too good. And there's no demo will ever that you sort of leak out. You'll never hear it, and it'll never happen. So maybe my favorite Steely Dan song is the second arrangement, the version of the second arrangement that we've never heard, the erased version.
Oh,
That's what I'll say.
Yeah, that rough, like whatever, that's just unbelievable. Just, I wish I could hear the finisher. Just man.
Don't you? With like some Michael McDonald vocals on there,
just really heaven, that heavenly Michael McDonald voice.
When you get to heaven as a Steely Dan fan, that's the first thing that they do. They press play on the second arrangement. They're like, here, you can hear it now. Sorry you died, but at least look, you got this. Sorry, your family's very sad, but like, here's the good news.
Makes me want to go to church now, man. I tell you, Alex, this was seriously such a thrill for me. I could not, like, Quantum Criminals is just. Again, like I'm like the target demo, and even still, like my expectations like over the top. Like I absolutely love the book. You can get it on May 23rd, and so just to wrap up, what can we look forward to? Like in terms, like give like your plugs and your just for the book and all that kind of stuff.
The book is out May 23rd. We will be doing events in various cities all summer. We'll be in New York when the book actually comes out. We're doing some stuff here in Los Angeles. We're doing Portland, Washington State. All this stuff will be like on my socials and stuff. To find. We have a very nice graphic that says where everything's going to be. If you're in London, there's going to be an art show of Jones' original paintings. For the book, which are amazing to see because they're very big, and it's like as cool as they look in the book, it's like I've never actually seen them in person, so it's very exciting to imagine being able to actually look at them. The paperback book, if you want to read my Keanu Reeves book, is sometime in April. I forget when, but it's before the Dan book drops. It looks very cool. It's yellow. If you don't have the hardback version, I would hold out for it. And yeah, that's enough, I think. I don't know what I'm doing next, but we're going to be promoting this for a while. So we may be, unlike Steely Dan, we will be on tour. We will come to your town. We're not afraid to face our audience. We will not going to hide in the studio all the time. We're going to be out there meeting you. But this has been really great, Ben. I mean, like the coolest thing about writing a book like this and sort of being in this kind of expectation phase of it coming out is that you talk to so many people who are really stoked about it. Like it's like that's the great part. Like obviously the average person does not care, but like I'm really in my sort of self-selecting group of people that I've talked to about this book, the excitement is really amazing. So I'm really grateful to you for having me on. And I'm flattered by it.
It's a true honor. And again, when someone next asks me, hey, why do you like Steely Dan? I'm just going to put this book in their face, be like, read this, and then come back to me.
Oh, I mean, look, if I could, I'm not in the business of making converts, but if it helps anybody who's trying to do that, as someone who has often struggled, there are like really close friends of mine and family members and people like that. My dad was like, I don't like Steely Dan. I was like, well, okay, I did know that because you never owned any of their albums. But like, there's all kinds of people in my life who I've tried to turn on to this band and they've just been like, yeah, I can't do it. Like I've made mixed CDs back when that was happening. I've made playlists. So if this helps people who are in that position, who are trying to convert people for whatever reason, I'm all for it. Good luck to you.
Thank you so much, Alec.
Ben, thank you.